Hello friends, my name is RagePanda1 and I think that I might have cracked the code of damage in Last Epoch that has been sort of eluding me because not all skills seem to be made the same, and I think that I know the secret why now, which is something that I haven't heard anybody talking about on the internet, although I haven't read every post that's ever been made on the actual internet. I will be revealing that secret towards the end of the video, but I think that we need to understand the basics of building your damage first because it's very important. However, in order to do that, I'm going to restructure how we're talking about this because most people will say base damage and they're talking about flat damage. And I think that adds a layer of confusion that we can easily strip away if we just reframe how we're talking about it. So my suggestion is, I think that we should move to referring to base damage as the flat damage plus the additional damage, because that is the base that our other modifiers are going to work off of. We're going to get more damage modifiers, which are multiplicative with this combined base damage. So that's the really important number that we're worried about. It doesn't matter if we're getting a higher base damage through getting more additional damage or more flat damage. We just want to make that boulder that we're multiplying of a big fat damage number a little bit bigger in any way that we can. And a lot of the ways that you're going to do that is by getting additive damage, which is percentage based. So I want to go over to Last Epoch Tools, which is a website that if you care about making your own builds, you should probably get familiar with it. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description below. And we're going to take a look at some of the affixes and when they're good, how they're good, why they're good, and what makes them better. Starting off, we'll take a look at this melee void damage that we've got on this brass scepter that we're looking at. In this tool, we can look at the different tiers and how they actually affect what we're getting. And it's very clear to see very early on that exalted items are super good because tier 5 of this melee void damage is giving us up to 26 and tier 7 is giving us up to 55, which of course is more than double what we can get from a tier 5. That's why the purple affixes are so important. Of course, the act of finding gear is its own video all on its own, so we're not going to go over any of that right now. But what I will mention is that all of these flat damage modifiers are going to be the same, whether it's lightning damage or cold damage or whatever you might have. If I add melee void damage through this method to a skill that's not normally void damage, then the melee void damage that I have added will scale off of bonuses to void damage, even if the main skill itself is not doing that. For this reason, when you're adding in extra damage and it has some sort of type associated with it, in this case void, we want that to match what our skill is doing so that we're getting the most out of scaling our additive modifiers. Now you might think that you have a cold skill, you're going to add in some lightning damage, and then you'll just get elemental damage, and that'll be just fine. It'll be the same. But actually, not all percentage additive modifiers are built the same. If we look next to it here, we've got necrotic damage, and at tier 7, we're getting all the way up to 210%, which, by the way, is pretty crazy for a one-hander, and it starts at an absolute minimum of 10%. That's going to be the same for all spell damage types, if it's just a single spell damage. But if we find elemental damage on our list, we can see that we're actually only getting up to 158% of a boost at the maximum and 9% for a minimum. So the lower you are, the less the disparity is actually mattering, but it does still always matter. So it can be very helpful to go for elemental damage, especially if you're doing a build where you're using all of those different elements. But if you're not, if you're just using fire damage, for instance, then you really want to be looking for fire damage percent modifiers. But if that happens to be a spell, you can use spell damage percent modifiers because they have the same scaling of 10% to 210% that any of the individual elements would have. In my opinion, that makes spell damage percent one of the most desirable for adding into lower level twink items because it doesn't matter what spell you're actually trying to upgrade, you're always going to be upgrading the spells. Even if your mage is doing ice and your warlock is doing some necrotic spells, they can use the same item and it's going to give the same benefit. So when you're making twink gear, using these globally viable options is a really good idea. When we get into things like spell damage and reduced mana cost, we can see that it's a much lower percentage that we're getting for the total spell damage that we're adding in here, but that's fine because it's reducing the mana as well, which can be extremely useful on certain builds. In fact, it can enable certain builds that otherwise would not have been useful at all. So when we're scaling our gear via these affixes, especially in the early game, what you're going to be looking for is flat damage, which is super good. We're going to try to make sure that matches the type of the skill that you're using. That means that if you're using a melee fire fire skill, you're going to add melee fire damage. And then we're also going to try to get some of these percent modifiers, but when we're looking at a weapon, we want flat damage as much as we can possibly get it. These other percentage modifiers we can get in other slots, rings, amulets, belts, and it's much better to go with the flat damage in the places where you can, and the percent later on, because you need both to be able to snowball this big base damage number. And remember, I'm referring to base damage as both of these things combined. So we've constructed our big rock of base damage, and we're ready to make it fly into the atmosphere and destroy our enemies. So how are we going to actually go about doing that? The best way that we can go about doing that is getting more damage modifiers. Generally speaking, these modifiers are found in your skill trees, sometimes your passive trees, and they're going to say that they will make a skill do more damage, and then in parentheses it will say multiplicative with other modifiers. This is when you know you've struck gold. That is absolutely fantastic. So we've got this formula here that's going to give us our base damage, and that's simply our flat damage plus the flat damage times the additional damage multiplier. So let's pretend that our flat damage is 100, and in this example we'll say that we have 400% spell damage adding on to our flat damage. So in that case we're going to end up with a total of 500 damage, and we're going to call that our base damage. Now if I had 100% extra of my additive damage here, which looks like a multiplier, right? Because it's telling you in percentages. If I added 100% to that, then I would only be getting 100 more damage. I would only get one extra full set of that flat damage from that 100% additive. But with multiplicative multipliers, they happen after the fact. So if I have 100% of a multiplicative multiplier, instead of doing 500 damage here, I'm going to be doing 1,000 damage here, literally doubling the amount of damage that I'm getting. That's the power of multiplicative multipliers. They are so important for scaling your damage, and you really want to take them almost as often as you can. There are situations where additive damage is going to be better. There are situations where more flat damage is going to be better, but you want to be aware of the multiplicative multipliers that you can get, and you want to use them as much as you can possibly use them if you care about scaling your damage. That's really where a lot of it comes from. So how can we do that? Well, on gear, there are actually two ways that we can accomplish that, aside from any uniques and that sort of thing. But from regular affixes, we can get critical strike multiplier, which does work as a more damage modifier, and also we can get penetration for our specific type that we're trying to do damage with. We might be trying to do lightning damage, and if we get lightning penetration, then that's going to add as a multiplier for us too. Even if the person that we're trying to fight against has 0 resistance to lightning damage, if we have 20% penetration, then that's actually going to give us a 20% more damage multiplier, even if it's going negative. It doesn't matter if they had nothing to start with. You don't need anything there to reduce, which is the case in some other games where you'll strip away people's defenses, and then that will reduce the amount that they are mitigating damage. So there's two versions of penetration, and one of them is shred, and the other one is actual penetration. They both work the same way essentially, except for shred seems to be more like reducing the armor that they have. It can still go negative, so it still works the same way. Penetration seems to be just ignoring the defenses that they have for that particular attack. For that reason, shred can actually be a little bit better, because if you're shredding their armor, then other skills can benefit from it as well. But if you're only doing the penetration on the specific kind, there could be situations where other skills are not getting that same penetration, and so I prefer armor shred where I can get it, but penetration is absolutely fantastic. And when you look at high-end builds, you're going to be seeing both of those things usually built into some part of the kit, whether it's passives or affixes or whatever you have. So one thing we can do is we can come into our tree here for our skills, and we can type in on the top right and just type in more. And you'll see these little dancing fairies going around the skill node. That means the word more is there. That doesn't always mean that it's multiplicative, so you got to still look at what it is. But if you just type in more, you'll find in your skill trees things like this. Avalanche hits deal more damage to frozen enemies, and you'll notice in the parentheses it says multiplicative with other modifiers. Now what's even crazier about these multiplicative with other modifiers is that it will multiply using one of them, and then it will take that new sum and it will multiply for the next one. So if you're stacking on many variations of multipliers, you're going to be doing significantly more damage than you would have otherwise been doing. So taking it from the top here, we've got our flat damage plus additional damage to give us that big solid base we're going to build off of. Then we're adding as many multiplicative modifiers as we can possibly find, and this is where it starts to become a little bit different. There's more than one kind of build that you can do. You can be going for hit damage, or you can be going for damage over time. And the subtle difference here, it's not that much, but damage over time cannot crit. So that's one modifier that you're just not going to have access to for multiplying the damage, but you'll be able to put in those slots things that are going to scale your damage over time. Now, if you have bleed, for instance, you can still scale that with physical damage percentages that will be additive. If you have physical damage penetration, it will also penetrate for bleeds. Some of them are specific. Sometimes it'll say physical penetration for bleeds. Then use your common sense. That's not going to work for hit damage. I'm sure you could have figured that part of it out. It's a very complicated system, but most of it you can just read and understand as you're going along. So I'm going to take you back into the game for a second so we can look at hit damage versus damage over time. I just pressed G to bring up the guide and then typed damage up in the top, and we're looking at hit versus damage over time. Usually when you think of damage over time, you're thinking of things such as ailments, which are ignites, bleeds, poisons, all of the usual suspects there. But in this game, other things are considered damage over time if they continue to do damage to a specific area over time. Fire aura, tornadoes, consecrated ground, and things like that. It's possible you could have a skill like this avalanche skill where I cast it and it does hit an area over the course of time. Normally this is channeled. I have it set up so that it is not channeled. It just follows me around, and you might be tempted to think that that makes it a damage over time spell based on the guide, but the little trick that we're going to use is that we're just going to hover over our skills. On avalanche, I can look at my scaling tags, and I know I'm doing physical, cold, spell, area, and attunement scaling on this particular spell. On tornado, however, it specifically lists that this is a damage over time skill. That's how you can tell if you're not sure which one is which, so that you know which thing that you're scaling for. Now, obviously, my avalanche, these damage per second estimations, by the way, are not super reliable, so take them with a grain of salt when you see them. However, I'm scaling a decent amount of base damage here. I'm scaling a bunch of crit and crit multiplier, so my scaling for avalanche is considerably higher than my scaling for tornado, and so tornado's not doing nearly as much damage. However, it costs me almost nothing, and it's a significant damage boost as I'm running around in the maps. So if I switch my weapon and I'm no longer having spell damage on my weapon at all, instead of doing almost 7,000, I'm doing 3,000. Instead of 30,000, it's down to 10. That's just from removing the base damage, essentially. I'm getting a little more than that from this staff that I'm using for other reasons. It's not the best staff in the world. I'm just trying stuff out, but I get a ton of spell damage from that, and that ranks my numbers up like crazy because these both scale off of spell damage. However, when we get to ailments, we are not going to be scaling those off of our spell damage. We will scale them off of our percentage additional damage modifiers, like ignite will scale off of elemental percent or fire percent, as well as scaling off of new affixes like the damage over time scaling, elemental damage over time, all that good stuff. How we're really going to scale that damage though, instead of adding more flat damage like we're doing in these more hit-based builds, or the damage over time effects like tornado that scale off of those flat damage bonuses, the way that we're going to scale our ailments is by putting on more ailments. If you want to do a lot of damage with ignite, you're going to get chance to ignite. If you're using a skill that has a chance to ignite to produce ignite, and that's the way that you're doing all of your damage, you want to be doing that skill as fast as possible. So you're looking for cast speed or attack speed, depending on what kind of skill you're using. If you're doing a melee attack, you need melee attack speed. If you're casting spells, wouldn't you know it, you need some cast speed to scale those up. Now, I think that this is one section of the game that people are kind of not fully understanding, is in that ailments specifically are their own special subset of damage over time skills, and damage over time skills work separately from our hit skills. So not only can damage over time not crit, but also the danger with hit skills is that they can be dodged, blocked, or turned into glancing blows. Damage over time effects do not have that problem. They still will get their damage lowered by resistances, and it's also important to know that damage over time effects will not trigger health gained on hit. So if I have this tornado following me around, it's a damage over time spell. I'm not getting on hit health from having that on me. So in the end, these are really the only two formulas that actually matter, is that your flat damage plus additional damage equals your base damage. This is still technically true for ailments. However, you're not scaling the ailment's flat damage by adding in extra flat damage from your affixes and gear. I hope that that makes sense. They have their own flat damage per stack, and that's what you're gonna get. Then we take that base damage and we add a multiplier and a multiplier and a multiplier. If you're doing a hit-based build, not a damage over time build, then you want to include crit and crit multiplier as much as you possibly can into those hit damage builds, because it makes a huge difference, as well as shredding enemy armor and getting penetration. For your ailment builds, it's even more important. Now, attack speed is good for pretty much every kind of build. Not every build, but pretty much every kind of build. But when you're trying to stack ailments, it's one of the most important stats that you can possibly try to get, because you need to have as many stacks as you can possibly have on somebody to be doing serious damage. So we're going to increase our chances to apply these dots, and then we're going to increase the frequency of applying these dots with a skill. And I'm going to demystify the additional damage a little bit more after I talk about the secret sauce that I think that I might have found here. Now, I was playing through the leveling guide for the Blade Dancer, and Umbral Blades was just doing crazy, insane things, doing a ton of damage, and I wanted to know why, because some skills seem to be performing a little bit better than the other ones. You see Frostclaw all the time. People like Static Orb. People like Chthonic Fissures for the Warlock. People are enjoying Detonating Arrow like crazy, and of course, the Wraithlord build. So what do all of these skills actually have in common? I think I might have figured it out. All of these skills are doing multiple things with a single cast, and I think that's really what it comes down to. They tried to change the scaling so that things like this wouldn't happen. When we look in the base damage section here, we see that it says 12 physical. It's got a 5% crit chance, 200% crit multiplier, and the added damage effectiveness is 60%. Now that's actually quite low, and what that means is that when you are adding in your flat damage, you're going to get less of it from the Umbral Blade's skill itself because of how the skill works. So they tried to balance what I'm about to talk about, and I don't think they nailed it. I think they messed it up, and that's why some of these skills are performing so much better. So the way that Umbral Blades actually works is that it throws 2 blades, and then it throws 4 blades, and then it recalls all of them that are stuck in the ground back to you. And the way that we were playing it is we were using our Blade Storm, and what that does to our skill using the Blade Storm is we're forced to take this huge damage multiplier. This is multiplicative with other modifiers for 250%. So obviously, the way that we just described how damage works, that's kind of huge. That's kind of a big deal, and you're getting a lot out of that. But then you go into this node where the blades spin in place and they continue to do extra damage. And this is where they forgot that scaling was important, because you're getting all of the crazy scaling from this multiplier, but you're pressing one button and it's taking advantage of that scaling multiple times as it continues to spin. And all of these skills that are super important are taking advantage of the scaling more than one time. When we're looking at the Detonating Arrow build with the explosive traps, you throw out your traps and a ton of effects start to happen all over the place. And what you end up getting from that is you're abusing all of the extra scaling over and over and over again with one button press. Some builds that work like that, it's a bit of a trick, to be honest with you. Some skills are a little less popular that kind of work that way because they're awkward to use. And my Avalanche skill that I'm testing out here is sort of one of those. But just to give you another example of how this is sort of double dipping on scaling, and that's what's making these certain abilities overperform like crazy. If you take a look at the Wraithlord, for instance, you're buffing up all of your minions and making them super strong. And then your Wraithlord comes along and eats all of your minions, and then he gets all of the buffs from all of the people that you had already buffed up. We're just going to take a look at the helmet because that's all that really matters. It says that you summon a Wraithlord instead of a Wraith, and then he summons Wraiths for you that use the same Wraith tree that you've already spec'd into. But at the bottom, when we are at maximum Wraiths, he will start to consume all of your other minions that are not Wraiths, and he's going to gain temporary maximum health equal to 10% of their maximum health, which you're increasing with your gear, and they're all getting that increase, and they're all going into this guy and just making him this huge tanky monster who doesn't want to ever die. Luckily, they were smart enough to cap the spell damage at 10 spell damage per consumed minion, but that still adds up like crazy, and that shows you how much building that extra spell damage, which is our flat damage in our base rock, gets crazy. That's why this build is so good, because he keeps stacking that like a madman. So I've been trying out wacky stuff, and right now I'm just doing tornadoes and a little avalanche action, and that summons a little maelstrom around me, but really it's all about the avalanche, because I wanted to explore how this concept works of me pressing a single button and having it do a lot of extra stuff. And as you can see, it works pretty dang well. All I gotta do is walk around and not really participate all that much. Some people might not think that's very fun. I think it's interesting enough. And I can have my little Spriggan companion out here helping me and healing me and adding into my crit chances and all that good stuff. The problem is that my tornadoes don't scale off of the crit, so there's a lot of it that's not doing much there. And this is not a build that is fully refined, but you can literally just walk around and one-shot everything. I'm level 56 right now in a regular monolith, and it's absolutely no concern. And another random build here, I just charge around and I swing multi-strikes, and they hit a bunch of people with smites. And it does a lot of damage because I'm doing multiple things with one cast, and I really think that that's part of the thing that's making some of these builds so strong. If you could just walk around empowered monoliths and one-shot everything, then you're doing pretty okay. But this build does have a problem. If it's fighting a single guy, I have to stand a little bit away from them and multi-strike the air and not them, because otherwise it won't do any smites, and then I don't do any damage, and it's a problem. It is a problem when that happens. So there's all of these little concepts that might exist in your particular build, but you just have to look out for them and know how to scale the base damage, and then you'll be fine. Now, I just wanted to end the video by giving you a little bit of clarification on what additional damage might mean, and just keep in mind that all of these sources of additional damage combine together to be your one additional damage in our calculation that we're looking at up here. A lot of times, skills will scale off of the base stats of whatever class that you have. So if we're looking at intelligence or strength or dexterity, what have you, if that's on the scaling tags, then you're going to get a percentage of additional damage, which is usually 4% per point. Our additional damage includes the attributes as well as percent damage, percent increases from affixes. Any nodes that say additional damage are going to add into that same pool. So all of these things are adding into the same number. That's very important to understand. It doesn't matter if you had elemental damage over time and regular damage over time. They're going to combine into being the same ultimate number. For me, that was something that I was confused about at the very beginning because it's not made super clear how that works. When you think about it, it unravels itself pretty quickly, but we all make mistakes, and that's one that I made. And of course, I think this should go in with the affixes, but I will put idols on the list because they tend to have that available as well. I think the mage has some where you get 30% damage to a particular element, and then if you have a certain amount of mana, it gets doubled. So I hope that I have managed to elucidate the way that we make our damage skyrocket, and I just want to emphasize that this second part is ever so slightly more important than the first part. The first part is very important. Flat damage, additional damage, great things. If you're multiplying 0, then you're going to end up with 0. So you need a number to start with that is relatively decent, but you're generally looking for these more damage multipliers wherever you can get them. In terms of gear, that usually means crit multi, with a hint of shred and penetration. And finally, I think it's pretty important to try to find ways to maximize those multipliers that you wouldn't normally see. For instance, the Swarmblade Druid will consume locusts, and if you spec into it a certain way, it'll consume bleeds as well, all to stack up and increase the damage that you're gonna get from your locust swarm that circles around you. In that way, you're taking all of the multipliers and all of the huge pool of damage you built up and combining it into one bigger skill. Anytime you can do that, I think you're gonna be doing a ton of damage. If you're not able to do that, then triggering multiple effects off of one cast can also be extremely good. Now, in a game this complicated, there are certainly things that I left out because every single unique is something that could affect the way that you're doing this damage calculation, but I think this basis covers it. If there's anything super important that you feel that I've missed, please leave it in the comments below. Not only am I trying to learn as much as I can possibly learn, but I want to help other people learn as much as they can too. I don't need to be the person who's giving everybody the information. You can be the star as well by just sharing your knowledge with the rest of us, and we all appreciate it if you do that. If you want to be around a community that is about that type of thing, then please do subscribe and like, and even share if you've got friends who are making some builds that just ain't quite working out. And if somebody shared this with you, do not be insulted. They were trying to help you, and they like you, and they think you're a handsome boy, okay? So you enjoy being a handsome boy, and of course killing a bunch of monsters and getting loots. For now, I want to thank you for watching. I have been Rage Panda 1, and I will see you in the next one.